that it will be available. So welcome everybody to the webinar. I guess I'm going to get right into it, because when I came and spoke to many of you a few months ago, we were still in the early days of this pandemic. I think if you asked, well, I know if you asked Canadians at the time, how long do you think this thing is going to go on for? Many thought it would take maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months to get through it. Very few thought, we would still be, where we are, and in fact, seeing the second wave and how bad it's become in many parts of the country and other parts of the world. And so what I'm here to do is give you some insight. We just completed a national survey. We interviewed almost 2,000 Canadian consumers, 18 plus across the country. I went deep and I looked at a number of new areas that I didn't explore last time, with some questions that I asked previously. But again, my goal here is just to bring you some data, give you some perspective on what I'm seeing. For those of you who know me, I love wine. I'm one of your wine lovers that I'll talk about in this group. So if you ever, want me to come by and taste what you're producing, I would love to. And I'm often down in Niagara and have been to Okanagan a few times now. So let's get into it. And I think, for me, there's a few takeaways I want you to sort of think about as we leave this conversation. One is, as you're going to see, concerns about the pandemic and what that means for consumer behavior, whether that's at home, whether that's in terms of travel plans, in terms of entertainment, is pretty substantial. And these concerns, I think, are going to persist as long as this pandemic is going ahead, and as long as we don't have a vaccine or any rapid testing or anything that reduces the perceived risk of certain types of behaviors. Two, I think we see more and more in our research, and just anecdotally, consumers are looking for comfort and discovery. They are, we've been stuck in our homes for much of the early spring. Then we were kind of released when it felt like the cases were under control, and we had a fairly open spring, late spring and summer. And now we, as we head into winter, are being constrained back to home, and we have varying degrees of it across the country, and even in Ontario, different levels of restriction. But there's still this sense that we can't really do what we love to do, and but we're finding ways to replace it. And that's something I'm going to get you to really think about in terms of your own operations, your own products, and how you meet people where they are and where they want to be. I do think there's continues to be an opportunity for wine producers in Canada to connect with wine lovers, give them an experience they can't get anywhere else. And I'll share some data that's new this time about travel, about expectations for the spring, and who might be coming and thinking about traveling into the different wine regions across the country. But to start off, kind of the bad news. And that's how Canadians are feeling about the pandemic. Right now, we finished a survey just this week, closed it up on November 3rd. Overall, how worried, if at all, is the situation with the pandemic making you feel right now? 39% of Canadians say they are extremely worried or worried a lot about things. Another quarter say they're somewhat worried. Only 6% are saying, I'm fine with this, there's no big deal, nothing to see here. And when we look at this number of most extreme worried, you see this spike in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. That's the hot zone right now in Canada. So that explains this increased anxiety. For most of this pandemic, actually, the prairies have been the least concerned. But you see outside of the prairies, pretty consistent numbers. In BC, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada, about 4 out of 10 people say they are have elevated anxiety around this pandemic right now. We see this persistent gap between men and women. It's closed actually over the last few weeks. Men were always less likely, significantly less likely at times, to be worried compared to women. And then even among ages, except for those younger folks who are a little less worried about this, we see consistent patterns across different age groups. All this to points is concern about the pandemic is very broad, and it goes pretty deep now. There's a deep level of concern. When we look at it from a slightly regional perspective, we see elevated numbers in Toronto, which might be a signal, again, about what their intentions are to get out of the city, or whether or not they feel comfortable doing that. But again, no real difference even between two groups that I'm going to highlight a lot today. Those I call wine lovers, who self-identify as those who love drinking wine, learning about wine, sort of the wine culture. They represent about 1 out of 5 Canadian adults. And then there's casual drinkers, which are a larger group, who aren't as, I guess, obsessed as I am about the beverage, but drink it quite a bit and enjoy it. And those are the two groups I'll come back to. But if we look at this trend line, this is that most anxious group. And you can see we're at a level now over the last month that we haven't seen since the very beginning of this. So the second spike in cases corresponds to a spike and a rise in worry. We see this in other questions we ask over the last week. Have you been getting more or less worried about the pandemic? You can see since September, elevated levels of worry. That's an indicator that people are getting more worried, not less. You'd rather see that green line go up. That's a signal that things are starting to normalize. What does that manifest itself? Half the country now are concerned about getting COVID themselves. Just over half are worried about a family member getting it. And those are significant increases from June, which I think was really the low point of public anxiety or concern around the pandemic. So big shifts over this period. The same, sort of the last bit of bad news, half of the country believe the worst is still to come. And that's this trend line. So again, as high as it's really been over the last few weeks than at any point since the very early days of the pandemic. So right now, today, the public's at a very different stage. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to persist. And if we're able to get these cases under control, if anxiety starts to dissipate, as we come out of the winter, our hopes is we get more into an area like this, because this is the zone in which more people feel comfortable leaving their home, traveling, taking some risks that they wouldn't do when they think the caseload is pretty significant. And it's all about risk perception. This was a survey we did a few weeks ago. We asked people how risky they perceive these different types of behaviors or activities to be. And you can see that Canadians do put an order to these things. Oh, excuse me. That, going grocery shopping is considered much less risky by more people than flying on an airplane or riding on a city bus. Right? You can see where going to an indoor restaurant might be. And I think you can equate restaurant with tasting room. Very similar in terms of the venue and the type of surrounding, especially obviously inside as the winter months come along. Staying at a hotel, still relatively high perception of risk. Shopping at a mall, right? There's lots of consumers out there who say it's very risky, and a sizable number who perceive some risk as well. So it's all about, as we talked about in May, mitigating that risk, making your visitor, the guest, the taster, the consumer feel comfortable coming onto into your premises. For those that invite folks into the wineries. One way that I like to summarize the public mindset now, we've got a lot of data from a few different sources, is to think about where the typical consumer is today versus where they were before the pandemic, right? Unemployment at 9%, down from where it was, but still much higher than it was before the pandemic. In fact, before the pandemic, we were seeing record low unemployment in Canada. Consumer confidence, business confidence has cratered. We've seen almost, not quite, but a substantial 10-point increase in job insecurity. That's the percentage of Canadians who feel that their job could disappear at any moment. A significant number. Almost all Canadians think we're in a recession, compared to only 30% before the pandemic started. More people are saving money. If you recall, when I was on with you in April, I talked about how while many households are being severely impacted financially, there's a lot of other households who have actually benefited from the pandemic. Their costs have declined, and so they're saving a lot more money, right? We see lots of home renovations happening, lots of spending on things that they may not have normally spent on or wouldn't have had the money to spend because now they're not traveling or they had less childcare expenses. Those are just examples of this. And plus, when we're defensive, we save. We try to protect ourselves for the future. You can see far fewer believe now is a good time to make a major purchase. And all of this, for those who are in GR on the call, are done in a context where our federal deficit has increased by $310 billion, right? So the whole world is fundamentally different from a consumer's mind than it was before all of this. So the point of this kind of context setting is we see growing anxiety about COVID-19 as a second spike continues. Many think it will take a year or more before we're back to normal. And I think as we talk about what is going to stick in terms of behavioral change and what's not, question I'm always asked, I think the longer this goes on, the more likely those shifts in behavior are going to be the new normal, are going to be how we grocery shop. If we never grocery shopped using Instacart before, and now we do it all the time, odds are we're going to probably keep doing it because we've gotten used to it. We got into a groove, and maybe we've learned it's more convenient and we enjoy it more. I'm not one of those folks. I like going and touching the food that I buy, but there's a lot of people who could care less and hate grocery shopping. And this has given them the technology to enable it. It's also created opportunities, as we'll talk about in a minute, for your sector to, depending on restrictions in terms of interprovincial trade and all that kind of stuff, which I'm not going to get into, direct to consumer, whether you're an agency, whether you're a producer, right to the consumer, is much more possible today because of both some restrictions lifted and also consumers looking for interesting products and ways to be delighted. So that's really the bad news. And I don't necessarily know where we'll be come, say, April or May when hopefully more of the visitors will flock back. It doesn't mean you close your doors over the winter, but you're certainly not going to see as many. I'll just bring this up because this is the segmentation we did and we replicated in this new survey of the different segments that we or I came up with. And I should just note, my colleague Jonathan Nadeau is on the call. He's he got me into wine. I credit him with my obsession now. We kind of built this out together, and we are really going to focus on the wine lovers, the 20% of consumers who consume the most wine and describe themselves and identify as folks who really love everything about how it's grown and produced to all to the stories behind the winemakers. And if you go down that list, you get, a majority of consumers consuming at least some wine. There's a sizable group who really don't like it, and you know that, and I'm not going to focus on them. Just a reminder who the wine lovers are. In our second data set, these variables were confirmed. We don't see a real age divide. There are a lot of young wine lovers out there, both men and women equally describe themselves in this way. But we do see some socioeconomic differences. Not surprising. Those who come from higher income households, those with higher levels of education, are much more likely to describe themselves as wine lovers. They can afford it, and culturally, I think it fits closer with what they are and who they see themselves as being and what wine plays in their life. So as of last week, when we asked folks how many times in the past week have you consumed these different beverages, and I added cannabis in there as a comparator. And you can see that these numbers really haven't changed from the survey we did in April. About 35% of adults across the country have consumed wine at least once in the past week. Slightly lower than beer, higher than spirits, and you can see cannabis. That's the interesting sub-story in this data is, I think, expanding and growing, and consumption of cannabis, I think, is starting to move forward. When we ask people compared to last month, are you consuming more, less, or about the same amount of these products? Not a huge directional shift in any one of them except for cannabis. I think you are seeing some momentum, particularly in Ontario, where it took a while for retailers to get up and running. There's greater access to it. And so I think there's a growing amount of variation of products. You now have edibles and beverages and a growing range of products from CBD all the way to THC that I think is connecting. So this will continue to be a potential increased competition for wine and for other alcoholic beverages going forward. So for beer, you can see beer actually is the highest number of those saying they're drinking less than they were before. I think partly because we drink more beer in the summer than we might otherwise do. In terms of wine lovers, what makes them unique? Well, they're much more likely to say they're consuming more wine than they were before. Only 12% are reducing their consumption. But the reason they're wine lovers and what makes them unique from everybody else is almost all of them have consumed wine over the past week, and 6 out of 10 have consumed twice or more. So that's what makes this group, from a consumption behavior, particularly important. Now, I'm going to bring this data back up. These are questions we asked in April for anyone new who wasn't on that webinar. We asked all Canadians, and then we signal out wine lovers a few attitudinal questions that I think go to the heart of sometimes the challenges that Canadian wine producers, as you all would know, face. And that is the perception that, one, the quality isn't there, two, the value is not there, and three, the mystique isn't there, right? The idea that I'm drinking something that's from an exotic place, a place I'd like to be, whether it's France or Italy or Australia. Canada, as much as we love our country, isn't that unique in our minds sometimes. And so one of the things I think we have to do in this pandemic period is we have an opportunity to recreate that mystique and to introduce Canadians to regions and terroirs and differences within even regions that they didn't necessarily know. But, most Canadians, but not all, think that Canadian wines are as good as wine produced elsewhere. Just about half, and same number about for wine lovers, think that Canadian wines are good value compared to other wines. Again, these are perceptual barriers that you're up against. But the challenge is, and you'll see this tied to the lack of access, which I explored more in this survey, is only a minority of both consumers as a whole and wine lovers say, I will always try to buy locally produced wine. This is lower, I believe, than we would see in some other product categories, where if we asked about produce, or if we asked about meat, or if we asked about other types of products, I see in other research we do, I do work with the dairy farmers, for example, which can really only get Canadian dairy in large parts. Canadians are driven to the local product. That's not the case when it comes to wine, and I think it remains the gap that I know your national association, I've seen the ads, by the way, Dan and Asha, on my Twitter feed, really pushing the story about the artisans and the uniqueness of Canadian wine. But one of the things that I wanted to explore in this survey, and this came out of a conversation with Dan and his team about, and I've heard from others, just the challenge that you have in different parts of the country accessing different markets and the trade barriers that exist. So I wanted to explore, do Canadians actually perceive there to be a problem, right? Because I think particularly from an advocacy perspective, if you're out there talking about the fact that, if you go into an SAQ in Quebec, there's very few Canadian wines on those shelves. If Quebecers don't perceive that, then you're never going to convince them to put pressure on the provincial government to open up those provincial borders and let more Canadian wine flow in. Same thing for Doug Ford in Ontario, or the provincial government in Alberta or in Atlantic Canada. And so what we did is we asked people, thinking about liquor stores in your area, do you feel there is a lot, some, a little, or no Canadian wines available to purchase? Now, this is a crude way of measuring, because we're not asking consumers to, identify how many bottles or how many different brands or how many different regions are available. But from your gut, you think that you have a lot of choice or not a lot? And the way I interpret this question is, very few people think there's a lot of choice. We'll look at those in a minute, including wine lovers who would know more than the average consumer. Now, people perceive that there's no sort of lack of access, so very few say little or none. Most people go in the middle because I don't think they really have a way of assessing that. So that's one of the challenges, I think, in this perception challenge, in fighting to get access to different regions and opening up provincial borders, is I don't know if people, particularly in different parts of the country, can assess this effectively. When we look at this question by region, so for example, consumers, the BC numbers here are consumers and wine lovers who live in BC. Not surprising, where we have larger, where the wine regions are located, you see a perception that there's higher availability of Canadian wine. So in BC, 57% of wine lovers say there's a lot of Canadian wine on retailer shelves, 44% in Ontario, 34% in Atlantic Canada. But look at Quebec. Only 16% of wine lovers in Quebec, those who would actually know, believe there's a lot of Canadian wine on their shelves, right? So we do see at least some logic in these numbers based on the availability of these products actually on these shelves, right? Alberta kind of falls in the middle, and then the prairies in Quebec well back. When we asked people how much wine, if at all, is available from the following provinces in liquor stores in your area, this is the national picture. And because Ontario is the largest province, it's going to see the sort of higher numbers. So green is those who say, I find a lot of Ontario wine. 18% say they find a lot of BC wine on the shelves. I put Quebec wine in there because I know in Quebec it's unique. I've never seen a bottle of Quebec wine in Ontario anywhere. So it was important just to see that comparison. And then Nova Scotia, 4% of Canadians say they see a lot of Nova Scotian wine on their shelves. Now, this doesn't really tell us a lot until we go deeper. First, when we look at wine lovers, same kind of pattern. Perceptions is that, I might be able to find a lot of Ontario wine or BC wine, particularly if I live in those provinces, but elsewhere, I'm not going to find that much. So in BC, this is what the picture looks like. So British Columbian say, well, I think I can find a lot or some BC wines on stores in BC, but I'm not seeing very much Ontario, certainly not seeing any in Quebec, and very little from Nova Scotia. We do this thing in Alberta because Alberta's neighboring to BC. I'm there quite a bit. I've got family in Alberta. You typically see way more BC wine. You hardly see any Ontario wine. That perception plays out as well. In Ontario, not surprising, the complete opposite. 54% of Ontario consumers believe there is a lot of Ontario wine in LCBO or grocery store shelves, but very little from the other regions. And then in Quebec, which I find really interesting, perceptions are not a lot of Ontario wine, maybe a little bit more BC wine, not even a lot of Quebec wine, there's not much of it, and very little Nova Scotian wine. So the point of this is, I think, particularly from the advocacy perspective, which I know you've been working really hard to convince provincial politicians to change the rules, is that I think you do see consumers recognizing they don't actually have very good access to these products. Whether or not there is enough producers in Nova Scotia to create a perception there's a lot of Nova Scotian wine, I think is beside the point. The point is, I think, particularly in Quebec, if we use that as a case study, there's a really clear indication that they don't think there's a lot on the shelves. Now, second question is, do they want more Canadian wine? And there's a few ways to look at this. One is to say 35 is not a great number, right? I think there's work to do, and that's part of the underlying challenges that I think the brand of Canadian wine has about being maybe poor value or poor quality, which we all know is not true, but is the perception that exists. Among wine lovers, little better numbers. Half say they want to see more Canadian wine in stores. That's a great number. Maybe not as great as you'd like it to be. Very few say I want less. And another 42% say same as now. So the point here again is these perceptions matter. And if politicians aren't feeling the pressure beyond your associations and your businesses to asking for changes, they're not feeling it from their constituents, it's probably not going to happen. And so it does require you to think about and communicate, how do you demonstrate to people that they just aren't getting access to a wide breadth of wine. Shifting gears slightly, this is another question we asked. In the past month, have you purchased these products? So again, slightly higher for beer than wine overall, but you can see wine lovers are typically higher consumers of all of these products. So that's a signal that they generally like alcoholic beverages and are taking part in all of these, but particularly on wine, 74 has purchased it in the past month. And what I wanted to explore again this time is whether we see any big shifts in how people are buying the wine that they're consuming at home. And what we find is actually not a whole shift. And I think it's challenging in a survey to really get at whether direct order or pickup delivery from a restaurant, now that it's available in many parts of the country, is going to gain speed, because we're talking about large numbers of people, and a significant shift even in your own business might be meaningful, but wouldn't show up in a national survey or even a regional survey. So for the most part, even wine lovers are buying most of the wine directly from a retailer. Only 10% say they've ordered directly from a producer, and you can see some substantial, not insignificant numbers ordering online or by phone from the producer, or pickup or delivery from a restaurant. So 3 or 4 months on, I guess more than that, since April, we haven't seen much shift in these numbers, but I think they'd be hard to identify. I just see there's a question here, so I'm going to see if I can. That's a good question from Veronica. Did you ask how consumers know they're drinking Canadian wine? I asked because LCBO signage is misleading. Yes, with the ICBs, I didn't. So that's a whole other maybe area we can explore, but I think that's also an important one. Like, these perceptions are important. So, you know, when I walk into an LCBO, I think it's pretty clear there's like an Ontario section, and there's quite it appears to be lots of options, but I don't think that's the case in other provinces, or when I walk into an Alberta liquor store, for example, or a wine shop, there may be a Canadian section, but I was in one in Edmonton, Bin 104, one of my favorite wine shops. Not a lot of Canadian products in there, but a lot of American, a lot of French, a lot of Italian. But you're right. I don't know if they actually know if they're drinking Canadian or not. The perception is they might be. Good question. So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about travel. We've been doing quite a bit of research. We worked with all the regional tourism operators in Ontario and Destination Ontario. We did a big survey in June looking at travel and the impact that the pandemic was having on travel. What we obviously learned was people were not leaving the province pretty much. They were staying local. This, you know, last year was the year of the RV. I'd like to say we did some work with an RV company that really showed that. But when we look at the travel opportunity here, we asked people in this survey in the past few months. So this is really a look back. Have you visited a winery? And these are the overall numbers. We only asked these questions of those who either love wine or are casual drinkers. We didn't include this for everybody because we wanted to make the questions pretty meaningful. And you can see, at least in our survey, 1 out of 4 wine lovers say they have visited a winery directly in the past few months. That's a sizable number of consumers. If we think that of the, say, 30 million Canadian adults that we would have been included in our universe, and that 1 out of 5 of them were wine lovers, that's a sizable number of people who are coming in. But what's more important is, who are they, at least in our survey data? And what's interesting, and I don't know if this matches, you would know the actual people who are coming in, but those who are reporting they're visiting wineries, majority, clear majority, 2 out of 3 say they're under 45. Interestingly, Quebec had a high number of people saying they are recent winery visitors, higher than their population would be nationally in terms of their proportion of the population. There's about 23% of the population live in Quebec. We see, interestingly, no real deviation across income groups. So once you're a wine lover, once you are a casual drinker who drinks wine regularly, your income doesn't then become a factor about whether you're going to go and visit a winery, right? Because that might impact whether you are fall into those categories, but not then what you do once you're in it. And interestingly, we had other data questions in this survey. Those who were particularly worried about COVID were just as likely to visit a winery as those who were not, which suggests that the pandemic and worry about, you know, infection and the risk involved doesn't appear to be a key driver in preventing people from coming. Maybe that's why you know, younger people are a little more likely perhaps now than they would have than older people because of risk perception, but it doesn't appear to be a key factor. What we also have learned, and not surprising, and this data is just kind of confirmation of what we expect, wine lovers who had a trip, this is the percentage of wine lovers who had a trip to a wine growing region canceled because of COVID-19. And where were they going? Well, they're going to the West Coast of the US, significant numbers saying they canceled a trip to Italy. I lost the trip to Italy, Portugal, France, Spain, South America. I didn't include, you know, a domestic destination because they could have still gone, but they canceled it. But the point here is what we already know, is that at least with the domestic market, you have, and I think it's going to carry over into the new year, an audience that really can't go outside the country. Either we're restricted to, we can't really easily go to Napa unless we want to quarantine when we're there and quarantine when we get home and get hassled at the border crossing. We can't go to Europe. We can't go to South America. And so if we want to experience wine and we want the wine culture, we are not stuck in Canada, but Canada's our only option. And so we asked people thinking about next spring, summer, or fall, how likely are you to visit these wine growing regions in Canada? And you can see that, Niagara and Okanagan, and interestingly, the Eastern Townships, which is where a lot of Quebecers will gravitate, particularly those living in Montreal, do get high numbers of either wine lovers or casual drinkers. That's the group we surveyed for these questions, saying they would be likely or might consider going to these regions. That's a lot of potential visitors, right? And I focus on this lighter green box. That's the might consider, right? That's the group that you as an individual winery or as a community or as a coalition need to convince that next spring, next summer, as people are starting to plan their trips and their vacations, which I think we all are, because it's going to be a long winter and we're not going to be able to do much over it. We are dreaming and hoping and imagining what we're going to do. And how do you instill with partners in the region, whether it's hotels, whether it's restaurants, whether it's other attractions, to create that experience that people are going to want to book and then look forward to doing, right? There is a clear opportunity here. And we see it in other research. If we did a survey in Ontario, as I said, and as I showed you earlier, nobody feels comfortable getting on a plane yet. And so they're going to be doing stuff that are in relatively drivable distances. So I live in Ottawa. Niagara Falls Niagara is pretty far away to me. It's like, 6-7 hours on a good day without much traffic around Toronto. Prince Edward County is much closer. I can get there in about 2.5 hours. But if I want to go to Niagara, before COVID, that would be the equivalent of me driving almost to the, mid New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine. I can almost get to the Atlantic Ocean for that kind of distance. And so the calculus is different. But now that I can't go to the US, Niagara is certainly on my radar. And so when we look at wine lovers and we look at Niagara as a destination, I just took Niagara and Okanagan as examples. Where are they coming from? Well, about half are going to come from Ontario, but you see sizable numbers of those in Quebec and in BC saying, I will likely visit Niagara in the next kind of core season. And we see, again, younger, more, but across all age groups saying they're going to do that. So again, if we're seeing an interest among younger consumers, what are you going to do to entice them to come? What kind of experiences are you going to create that are both safe and interesting and exciting to pull them there? In Okanagan, a little more concentrated among British Columbians, but you see, Albertans, third of wine lovers in Alberta say they're likely to go to Okanagan next season. And I know the surrounding regions, not just Okanagan, Quebec and Ontario, similar, much younger than older. And I think that's an indication perhaps of fear of some traveling and the interest and excitement and other attractions that Okanagan has to offer. So I'll wrap up. Lots of data there. What does this all mean? First is a question that I have been thinking a lot about. My colleagues at Abacus are thinking a lot about, talking to our clients about it, is how do we get to normal faster? I think one of the challenges that you're all facing is the on again, off again risk of opening and closing, of second or third waves, and what that all means. I think there is going to be a real opportunity to, whether a vaccine comes, and when a vaccine comes doesn't mean that everybody's going to take it. We have some research that's indicating, about 1 out of 4 people right now are resistant to the idea of taking the vaccine if it's available. It's only going to get potentially worse as it becomes more politicized in the United States and elsewhere. 2 is, though, can we use technology to improve that? I think we're seeing more and more opportunities. I think the pilot project in Alberta around rapid testing for international travelers, that works and it's expanded across the country. That creates new opportunities to invite, cross-border or overseas visitors again. But getting to that normal faster is going to be really important. Number 2 is, in all the other research we've done, I get the sense that, obviously there's a lot of anxiety, there's loneliness, there's this like endless dread of winter coming. But we're going to come out of this winter with such an enthusiasm to get out and explore that I think there's a real big opportunity for the sector not only to sell your products directly to customers, to get them excited about wine and tell your story, but the visiting side of your business and getting people into the region in a way that makes them feel that they're doing something different and unique. In the survey that we did in Ontario, for example, among those that were planning to take a trip this past summer, we did a survey in June, so we were looking ahead to the summer travel season. 52% said they are likely going to travel and do things related to food and drink, right? That is such, they weren't interested in going to, mass entertainment events. They weren't going to concerts because they can't. They weren't going to any place they thought there was a lot of people, but food and drink was a captivating reason for half of the travel community in Ontario that were willing to travel 40K outside of their community. And so being able to deliver delight and comfort from that travel experience is one side of it. But the second is, and I think this is more of how does the sector as a whole talk about Canadian wine? I think there's lots of research and insights we need to figure out still. But that gap between, I don't like the fact that only 35% of Canadians want to see more Canadian wine on shelves is an indicator that there's still work to be done. And expanding outside of even your own bubble is something that you really need to think about and how you communicate that. And I think that's important. As I said, there's a real opportunity for the coming travel season. Quebec, Ontario, I don't know if the border is going to open in time, but there's lots of folks who are looking for experiences. And just because you don't love wine doesn't mean going to a winery and doing a tasting and learning how it's made and being exposed to it won't create more wine lovers, because I'm an exact product of that. John Nadeau, I think, is on the call. And a few years back, Jonathan and him brought me down to Niagara and they toured me of Southbrook. And I went to Henry of Pelham. And I liked wine, I guess. I drank it every now and then, but I fell in love with not just, the farming side of it and the land, but also like the passion that's there. And that passion you don't often see. And I think that's what attracts people to food. It's what attracts them to art. It attracts them to wine. And how do you make that connection more clear and get more people to come and expand that wine loving audience, I think is really something that only you can do as sort of the front lines of that in Canada. The last thing I end with is what I've been saying from day one. And that is the difference between a consumer being able to do something and feeling comfortable doing it. And we have seen over the course of the last 8 months of this pandemic ongoing is you can open and close different types of establishments. You can allow people to go out and do certain things, but just because they can doesn't mean they will. And so creating certainty, communicating clearly, and making people who might be, say, driving from Toronto to Niagara or planning to do a weekend in Okanagan from Calgary, what are they going to expect when they come to your wineries? And how do you create a sense that not only is it going to be safe, but it's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting, because so much of what we do these days is no longer fun. We're in lines, we have to wear masks, we can't browse, retail is not fun anymore. How is the experience going to be what I have hoped to expect? It's hard to, know. And so I think it's incumbent upon different venues to communicate that clearly to us and show us what it's going to be like. And then I'm sure you're going to see far more excitement. So I will stop there. We've got about 15 minutes or so for questions. I did have, I'll let people answer some questions. I had a few poll questions and I'm going to launch. So if you feel up to it, answer them. I'm curious what the community is feeling. So the first question is, since the pandemic started, compared with 2019, is business better, worse, about the same? And then for different folks on the call, what's the biggest challenge facing your operation? Access to retail space, and I mean like getting your product into market, declining foot traffic, reduced tasting capacity, cost of doing business, access to labor, technology, or something else. And if you've got other questions, you can also share those. And I'll leave my contact info up too. And I'll just end this poll. So mixed results on, I can share the results. There we go. So you've got mixed results on the impact. Got about a third saying worse, almost half, which is great news, saying a little better or much better. And then in terms of business challenges, declining foot traffic, reduced tasting capacity is the #1 reason. I probably didn't capture everybody's business challenges, but still access to space and cost of doing business, a little bit of labor. That's awesome. Okay, I got one more. I'm gonna ask one more. How much has your direct-to-consumer sales changed over the past 8 months? A lot. Did it increase? Did it decrease? Not applicable to you. And then, has local domestic visitors replaced any lost foreign cross-border visitors? And I had a challenge with that question because I know you also lost capacity. So how do you measure that? But so I'm just seeing if there's any other questions. So I got a question from Jessica. She asks, the biggest issue we have been facing is the fact that if we are BC VQA and it's basically impossible to get into BC liquor stores, how would you recommend finding retail space in private stores? What can we do to encourage these stores to spend a bit more on Canadian wine? It's a good question. I think it's like it's a chicken and egg problem. Again, I'm not as close to your business to really know like how retailers are responding and what they're saying, but I assume the incentive is, will that product sell off my shelf? And I think this survey gives us some insight into that, right? Like I still do believe there are some challenges, and probably challenges that can be overcome with maybe, and again, I don't know what's available, tasting programs that allow people to actually taste the product and break those perceptions down that the quality of the product's there. I also think that as much as we sometimes are inclined to want to push retailers and consumers to buy local out of guilt, like we're going to guilt them into doing it, that doesn't work often that well. Like the reason somebody's going to support or want to support a local producer is because the table stakes have to be there. The product's good. It's competitively priced. It's going to, make me feel good when I either open it when I'm alone with my wife or when I'm entertaining with other people. People are going to think highly of me or think the way I want them to think. But then there also then it becomes like, well, then I'm supporting local, right? So you still have to deal with those core issues. So in my mind, you have to demonstrate to that retailer that there's no risk in putting your products on their shelves. And there's some data here to suggest that, there is a demand for it. I think people want it, but the sales data, I'm sure, tells the real story. And I don't have that data. I haven't seen it, but I suspect, sales of Canadian wine in some markets isn't as strong maybe as it could be if some of these brand challenges were dealt with. Good question. I'm going to just end the polling here, share you the results. And there we go. Lots of folks reporting big increases in direct-to-consumer sales. And we've seen a replacement sometimes of domestic traffic so that's really interesting. I've got a few questions. I'll get to Dell's later. Stephen asked, do you have any other information you can share about wine purchasing online? Still a very small base. What will it take to really broaden the reach of that direct-to-consumer option? It's a great question. It is a small base in our sample. I think I could go back and look, but we're going to talk about very small numbers. And so there's not much we can extrapolate from it. I think, my own experience is, and I've done some mixed cases from agencies. I've bought some wine direct from wineries. I think for wine lovers and those who are a little more sophisticated, it's fairly easy to do, but it's really not, as consumer friendly as it can be. It may be because of restrictions and regulations. So, I'm going to talk about the ideal, which I'm sure you all do all the time, but I don't know if I want to have to buy an entire case of one type of wine. I don't know if I want to buy a case of one winery's wine either. And I think there's a brewery in Ottawa called Dominion City Brewery, makes great beer. And they've, over the last few months, I think done something smart where they've not just only sold their products, but they've started to stock actually wines. I think they've got Hinterland, wine on their website that you can buy. They've got a bunch of local food products. They've got some even artisan soap, and you can literally order all this on their website. You go to their outlet, they drive through and they put it into your car. So they're speaking to a much broader audience who love fine local products and want to support those local producers, but maybe don't only want to buy their beer. And so that might be a way to start expanding the audience and getting people to see the value of going direct to consumer or direct to producer. I think the same reason that, and I know this is going to be maybe blasphemy to the audience I'm speaking to, but when I ordered a mixed case of Italian wine at one point this summer, what really got me was I couldn't get that at the LCBO, right? So that to me was what got me. But I'm the guy who orders the wine I don't recognize off a wine list at a restaurant, or am attracted to a varietal I've never heard of before. Not all consumers are like that, but I think that exclusivity, that uniqueness is something that's important. So yeah, that's a really good question, but I think there's more research that needs to be done because it's a brand new world, and the opportunities, if the province and Ontario particularly allow it to continue, especially even from restaurants, there's really interesting things that can be done there. Any other questions? Well, Dell asked me, because he knows I'm also a political junkie, how many electoral votes is Joe Biden going to end up with by the end of the day? I think at least 270. I'm not going to get into much politics, but I think he will get more of electoral votes. Whether Donald Trump lets him become president, I don't know. That's a whole other question. I've got a few other questions here from Peter. Are there any benefits to breaking down the wine lovers category into smaller subsets based on unique psychographics? Oh, I think there are. I'm just, scratching the surface. Thanks to the support from Wine Growers Canada, we were able to do this survey and do a fairly large sample, but we still only had about 500 wine lovers in our sample. So if we were going to break that down even more, it's not robust enough to get that. But I do think so. I tried to get at it. So I didn't share the results, but I'm going to keep working on this. But we have data where we asked a bunch of questions around, as I alluded to earlier, are you the kind of person who likes trying something new? Or are you somebody who, when you go to a restaurant, relies really on the sommelier to recommend wine, right? Are you a risk taker, or do you want expert advice? Are you someone who, loves to try something new, or do you go to your old favorites? I think we can do that kind of psychographic / behavioral breakout. And I think you'll likely find a number of different groups within that wine lover category that might be more naturally inclined to drink Canadian wine as a starting point, and might be naturally turned off by the idea of Canadian wine because they're so enamored by the old world or the new world or whatever. So yeah, Peter, I think there's lots of stuff we can do there. If there's anyone on the call who's really interested in exploring that, we can touch base after and we can see what we can do, but I'd love to be able to do that. Absolutely. Well, I think I'm going to end it there. We're early, which doesn't always happen. But again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, look us up online. Again, I want to thank Dan and Asha at Wine Growers Canada for partnering with us, giving me really good insight into the kind of questions to ask. We're only really scratching the surface here, but I do think there's a real big opportunity. And this is the moment. As much as this pandemic has created incredible disruption to our lives and to our economy, it's that one moment where all bets are off, right? Going to the province and saying, let's put more products in grocery stores. Let's allow restaurants to sell direct to consumer or not. I know it depends on, or let's open up the borders and let Canadians have access to Canadian wine everywhere. I think this is the moment to do it. Maybe not quite yet in the midst of sort of the second emergency, but this is where you can, I think politicians have allowed you to be creative, and they've created new expectations. And so it's a great time to be experimenting and trying out and seeing how consumers respond to it, because I think consumers are open to doing things differently as well. So on that note, thanks a lot, and hope to see you soon again. Take care.